For anyone that knows Robert Monks, I suggest you close your eyes and use your imagination. He's a bit taller, a bit more forceful, but it is an honor to have been asked to present these remarks, both because I've had the pleasure of working with Bob Monks since well before he came to the Labor Department and was working with a future White House counsel, not yet White House counsel, Boyd and Gray, on deregulatory efforts for then President Reagan, which included many discussions about and with the Department of Labor. And long before he had a vision of himself spending some time at the department. And secondly, because I've had the pleasure to work with Phyllis Borsey for even a little bit longer than that, and having had the pleasure of been with my boss, the executive director of PBGC, in the offices of the Pension Task Force on the Hill, and to have been introduced by Vance Anderson and others there to their newest recruit during the first week of her employment. And little did any of us in the room fully appreciate the length of tenure and the importance of the contributions that Phyllis would have made over the next decades and has in fact made. So in the words of Bob Monks, this is about the Department of Labor and Assistant Secretary Phyllis Borsey. Others may discuss at length the department's fiduciary role, but here I will simply share with you a fantasy of the importance of DOL administering retirement assets as a true fiduciary and an appreciation of the role of the professional staff since ERISA became law in 1974. And I'd be derelict if I did not add, as Phyllis has on many occasions, that without that professional staff, including some who are here, and their tireless efforts with her and on her behalf, this regulation would not have been achieved, and we might not in fact be here today to celebrate Phyllis and these accomplishments by her and her team. Just for openers, you should know that Phyllis's leadership is universally recognized. As Tara Siegel Bernard wrote in the New York Times, quote, "The perception is that the SEC will write a more industry-friendly rule, in part because the SEC is not headed by Phyllis Borsey, and in part because the securities fiduciary rules are more flexible than ERISA." He might have added that in future administration, we might be lucky enough to have Phyllis moved over to the SEC, and things might change. There really is an answer to making corporate power accountable to ownership. In my fantasy, now back to Bob Monks, it takes place in the Roosevelt Room in the White House. It's not as big as the Cabinet Room. It's got about 12 or 13 seats, and I have a fantasy. And the fantasy is that the President of the United States, a President of the United States, convenes the Chairman of the SEC, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Assistant Secretary of Labor in charge of employee benefit plans, and the Attorney General of the United States, who is responsible in the first instance for enforcing the law. And the President says, quote, "We have one government, and it is the policy of this government that the active, informed involvement of owners and companies is in the public good. It's the policy of this administration that we will encourage that," end quote. Now the three of you, with the banks, the mutual funds, with the SEC, and with the employee benefit plans with the Department of Labor, you administer laws that regulate the conduct of a majority of the stock of all public companies in this country. And I look to you to act together to promulgate standards by which you as owners are going to direct how your companies should be run. And I have here the Attorney General who will enforce the law if you come across with cases of violation and you can't enforce them yourselves. If that conversation took place in the Roosevelt Room, we could look for a very prompt change in how things are. But right now, we desperately need to change away from the language of economics, efficiency rather than morality. We definitely need to get away from a world in which we hire other people
to do what we should do ourselves. We need to get more involvement, and in the case of the owners of companies, that can be done. We need to restore a sense of trusteeship, of being accountable to inveterate and legally enforceable standards. We need to recreate the fiduciary culture. It can be done by a president with the right leadership. This president has begun the dialogue with the Department of Labor, and Phyllis has carried the Fiduciary Standards regulation through every imaginable obstacle presented by members of an industry, and I'll use the word industry in this case, who stand to lose $14 billion a year previously paid because of the neglect of enforcement of fiduciary principles. She is carrying on the fine traditions of the department and the litigation instigated by the solicitor's office interpreting the fiduciary principles of the statute. No one has said it better than Judge Henry Friendly at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. In Donovan versus Beerworth, he suggested strongly that trustees were so caught up in opposing the tender offer that they could not realistically have acted as independent protectors of the plan participants and beneficiaries' interests, and should have resigned their trusteeships in favor of more neutral trustees. Some years later in Lay versus Engel, Judge Cudahy explicitly ruled that trustees must faithfully avoid conflicted interests. Quote, "We reached that conclusion because the fiduciaries had divided loyalties with clear potential for conflicts of interest, because the fiduciaries with divided loyalties failed even to seek independent, disinterested advice regarding these investments and their duties to the plan beneficiaries, and because throughout prolonged contests for corporate control, the fiduciaries' use of the trust asset dovetailed at all times with the interests of the Eagle Group." Alas, it has been a long time since these principled court decisions. Assistant Secretaries Alina Berg and David Walker, Administrator Ian Lanoff, assisted by Alan Lebowitz and Mark Clevin, all have promulgated important initiatives stressing that fiduciary principles underlie the ERISA statute. The sole purpose and the exclusive benefit language means what it says. Having the preponderant shareholder of American companies informed by fiduciary principles is a massive step towards legitimizing corporate power through effective accountability to owners. The re-entry of the word fiduciary into informing language in the management of America's retirement assets is real progress. I might say more significant than real. It's amazing progress. Phyllis's work is a source of pride for those of us who believe that government can be a positive force in the lives of American citizens and in the provision of protection so that more may achieve retirement security. Thank you, Phyllis.